My name is Audrey Kurtler, and this is my final project for American Indian Studies. My subject and why I chose it. The subject I chose is a novel titled Ceremony, and you can see it on the screen. Ceremony is a piece of literature that I read last year in high school during an Intro to Literature college course that I took. I thought of this book when this project was introduced, partially because the book follows an Indigenous character, and partially because it was written by an Indigenous author. With that being said, this book wrestles with the ideas we've talked about in this class, and many of our course themes can be found throughout the story. Background information. Ceremony's author is a woman named Leslie Marmon Silko. Silko is descended from the Laguna Pueblo tribe, but she's also part white and part Mexican. Growing up in New Mexico on her tribe's reservation, Silko learned a lot about her tribe. She attended schools within the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and she has spoken a lot about how much she learned from stories told by Laguna Pueblo elders in her community. Though Ceremony is a fictional book, Silko uses her story to talk about some of the present-day realities and struggles of being an Indigenous person in the United States. One of the biggest struggles Native Americans face is alcoholism. Silko writes in depth about this as her characters use alcohol to try to deal with their PTSD from war. Another large struggle that Ceremony talks about is racism. Silko herself is part white and part Native, which makes its way into her story, as Tayo, who is her part white and part Native main character, faces racism, not just from white people, but also from other Native Americans. It's important that readers make the connection between Silko's life and Tayo's story. Ceremony is not just a book, it's a lesson being taught that people need to listen to. Context and function. I have the main bare bullet points on the screen, but I'm going to go into much more depth. Silko is good about incorporating lots of detail into her book. The reader learns early on that the main character Tayo has PTSD from fighting in World War II. The book begins after Tayo and his friends have already returned from war, but the timeline isn't linear. Silko does a great job of bringing the reader into Tayo's fragmented and tortured mind. His thoughts are jumbled at the beginning of the book. On one page, you're reliving war memories. On the next, you're snapped back into present times. His thoughts jump around a lot, and it's clear that Tayo is struggling to process his life. In a lot of Tayo's post-war memories, we see Tayo turn to alcohol to cope with his new reality. In one of Tayo's pre-war flashbacks, we learn that Tayo and his friends were promised a better quality of life if they went to war. Tayo and his friends were enticed by the promise of respect and new status as war heroes. They had hope that life would get better, but that hope was crushed when they came back from war and nothing had changed. Tayo and his friends fell into a despair of PTSD and hopelessness, which is why they turned to alcohol. Tayo's friends coped with their anger about the situation by drinking, starting fights with white people in the bars, and verbally bashing white people in general. One of Tayo's comrades, Emo, even goes as far as to blame Tayo because Tayo is part white. Of course, that doesn't help Tayo's healing. At first, Tayo tried to get help from white doctors for his PTSD, but nothing was helping and he was still sick and drinking. Overall, he hated his post-war life. Partway through the book, though, Tayo decided to meet with a Native American healer named Old Batoni. Tayo was skeptical of Batoni's methods at first, but soon Batoni's methods began to work. The story began to stay in the present more as Tayo began to confront the things plaguing him and he began to heal. Batoni's native methods fully take effect over halfway through the story, when Tayo throws up after a session with Batoni. In the words of Silko, he was expelling everything bad and starting his life anew. The main function of Silko's work Ceremony is to help people understand the realities faced every day by natives. The book helps readers see the lack of respect that natives face. It helps people see how easy it is for Native Americans to turn to alcohol because they don't have much else to turn to. It helps show people how lonely and isolating it can be to be a Native American in the United States. This book confronts the reader with a reality that isn't often talked about, and that's what's so important about Ceremony. Impact and theme connections. First up is cultural identity. The course theme of cultural identity shows up a lot in the book because of Tayo's mixed identity. He struggles a lot to fully accept his native blood at first, because he wasn't fully white, but he also wasn't fully native, so he felt like he didn't deserve to embrace his cultural identity. The reason it even took him so long to go to Old Batoni for help was because he didn't think that Batoni's native methods could help him because he was part white. Going to Old Batoni for help ended up being the best thing Tayo could have done for himself, because when Batoni's methods began to work, Tayo began to accept his cultural identity, and by the end of the book, he had finally fully accepted his cultural identity. Next up is stereotypes. The course theme of stereotypes shows up in ceremony during a lot of the bar scenes. Like I've already mentioned, Tayo and his friends came back from war with PTSD. They also came back to a country that still had no respect or value for Native Americans, regardless of whether or not they were veterans. With this information in mind, it's understandable why Tayo and his friends turned to alcohol to cope with their new reality. What's also sadly understandable is why so many of Silco's white characters in the bars would make fun of Tayo and his friends, and mistake these struggling war veterans for being, quote-unquote, just like every other Indian. Because of the harmful stereotypes about all Native Americans being alcoholics, Tayo and his friends had a harder time trying to find help and heal. Next up is colonialism. The course theme of colonialism is prevalent in ceremony because of Tayo's identity as part white and part Native again. Throughout the story, Tayo battled racism from both sides. Because of colonialism, he was looked down on by white people for being not white enough, and he was looked down on by Native Americans for being not Native enough. Under the lens of colonialism, Tayo was too Native in all the bad, stereotypical ways, and he was too white to the natives, who assumed that Tayo's mixed blood would influence him to act better than them. In the name of colonialism, white people wanted Tayo gone, and Native Americans thought Tayo wanted them gone. With neither group's acceptance, Tayo was lonely and isolated, making him a victim of colonialism. Last up is survivance. The course theme of survivance shows up in ceremony through Old Batoni's medicine practices and storytelling. A large part of what helped Batoni heal Tayo was telling Native stories and myths to teach Tayo lessons. By telling Tayo stories and practicing natural medicine, Batoni was helping keep his culture alive and spreading Native American stories and values to Tayo and to other Native Americans that he was helping. Without healers like Batoni, there would be much less of a fight to keep Native culture alive. Impact on my understanding. Ceremony helped impact my understanding of our course themes by showing multiple examples of different themes all within one story. In that one story, Silco used all her experiences and all the stories she had heard and all the things she had learned about Native Americans, and she used that to tell us a lesson, and it's our job to listen. It's an educational and emotional read, and I would definitely recommend reading Ceremony.